that raid.
All right, important for you to be there telling their stories. Hopefully they get those answers and context they want. Diane Gallagher, thank you very much. So the powerful evangelical voting base is overwhelmingly behind President Trump, despite what some say is behavior that contradicts their personal faith. So how does the president maintain their support? Our next guest has some ideas. cnnhowe is the author of The Immoral Majority, Why Evangelicals Chose Political Power Over Christian Values. He is a conservative evangelical Christian, and he joins me now. Ben, great to have you on the show again.
Thanks for
having me. I
read
read the entire book. Really deeply interesting.
I appreciate that.
You point back to one moment, and that moment was June 21st, 2016, in one specific picture.
Yes.
And you say this was a bellwether moment and a picture that spoke 1,000 tales. What do you see in this picture? Why is it important?
Well, when I first saw it, I was a little surprised that Jerry Falwell Jr., who's in the photo, was endorsing Trump. He had already said words about him, brought him to Liberty University prior. But I went to Jerry Falwell Sr.'s church as a kid. And my father was a Southern Baptist minister and then a seminary professor. They were evangelicals. And it immediately made me remember going to a march in Dallas in 1985. The protest was against Playboy magazine. Right behind them in that photo, Playboy magazine with Donald Trump on it giving a thumbs up. So to be clear, it wasn't my objection. You know, he can hang whatever magazine he wants. It was a surprise that the inheritor of his father's Christian legacy, and we've gone from protesting Playboy to giving a thumbs up and saying character doesn't matter. It was just fascinating.
And again, one of the big points of your book is it's a book not so much about Donald Trump as trying to explain the evangelicals who choose to support him. So in this case, it's Jerry Falwell Jr.
Yes.
endorsing him in front of a Playboy magazine, giving the legacy of his father, which gets to a quote, which I think the book is really all about here. You write, Donald Trump is the single greatest source of hypocrisy I've seen in the evangelical movement.
Yes. The cognitive dissonance that I think it has taken for a long time for evangelicals to claim in a way that voting Republican is voting for God. It was a little easier when you were dealing with perhaps a George W. Bush, who seemed like a pretty nice guy, and a born-again Christian and so on. With Trump, that was a little more difficult to pull off. He represented everything they'd stood against in the 90s in a lot of ways with Bill Clinton. So they had to start finding ways to support him in spite of that. And in a way, they were saying that they're going to support their values by voting against them, which is an unbelievable hypocrisy considering how often they scold the public for things that they do.
And you point out in your book, this was a movement that thought Bill Clinton was immoral and of too low a character to govern, despite the economy, despite whatever successes he had. And they don't apply, evangelicals, you say, that same fact pattern when they judge Donald Trump. You also seek to explain the various reasons. And this is where the book gets really interesting. You list four. I don't think we have time for all four here,
Sure.
but one, lesser of two evils versus Hillary Clinton. A second, compartmentalizing. But one of the most interesting ones is the idea that Donald Trump is a vessel.
Yes.
Explain that.
This is something that I've encountered a lot, and I've seen Christians use to explain other things in their lives. When something doesn't go right, often people, it's what God's will. Well, when you want something to go right, and you want to support something, for instance, that you normally shouldn't or wouldn't have, like Donald Trump, one of the quickest ways to rationalize that is to say that God's all-powerful and all-knowing, and he's using this man for a specific purpose in the same way that God used King Cyrus, for instance, that he's a vessel. But the issue with that is that they're not simply saying that he's a vessel for God's will. They're saying he's a vessel, essentially, for their will. They have assigned what his will is to it. They're not really thinking about whether or not they're doing the right things in the means to an end. They're just thinking about the end and then assuming God's on their side. And I think the reason that they assume God is on their side is because the evangelical movement, in conjunction with the Republican Party, has spent 40 years convincing people that when you pull the lever for a Republican, you're doing God's will. And I think that's super dangerous, and it's especially dangerous for Christianity because it repels people from wanting to hear anything about what we're about.
I want to make clear, and you make clear in this book, you support a lot of the things that Donald Trump has done as president. Given that, though, And in summation, why isn't it, in your mind, worth it? As someone who is a strong conservative evangelical Christian, why isn't it worth it?
I would say, well, the first thing I would say is what I find most interesting about the backlash that I get from other evangelicals on that point you just made is that I am taking the precise position that James Dobson, Ralph Reed, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell took about Bill Clinton in the 90s. They said that it didn't matter about the good economy. It didn't matter about the peace dividend. None of that mattered as much as having a person's character that's going to be an inspiration to Americans and not solely the name of American values. So I first find it interesting that they would have an issue with that. But I think that overall, these policy issues that we can win in the short term, that a conservative would be interested in, they're not going to last beyond the time he's there. I mean, if you take religious liberty, for instance, that's one of the big hot issues that conservatives talk about. I think every American cares about religious liberty, and they want it to be protected. If you assume Hillary wouldn't have and Trump would, which I think is false, but let's just take their comparison, great, it'll be protected while he's there. But if you've ensured that the thinking of conservatism won't be supported in the future, you've sacrificed the future for the present. That can't get less biblical than sacrificing the eternal for the present.
So the book is The Immoral Majority by Ben Howe. There's a lot in here that will fascinate, I think, people from both sides of the spectrum. A lot that will piss people off on both sides of the spectrum right there.
Absolutely.
Liberals and conservatives will both be coming after you for some of the things you write, which makes it all the better.
Yeah.